Well, here we are with part two of the video for our discussion around theories of gender in organizations. You may be wondering at this point why on earth we're starting with organizations and talking about organizational theory in a sense and how gender intersects with organizational theory. And I guess my answer to that would be that we're starting this course looking at kind of the I shouldn't say kind of, the broader context in which gender interactions take place. And then we're going to move to the more specific as we go along throughout the course. So that's my rationale. Also, some of the theory at this point tends to be a little more dense and requires a lot more time and thoughtful consideration. And so at this point in the course, you're not worried about assignments and all that sort of thing to the same degree that you will be later. So it seemed a good time to be concentrating on some of the more global issues. So that's my rationale, and I hope that it works out for you. Okay, so we've talked about the Connell piece, and again, apologies for continuing to use the wrong gender pronouns as far as Raywin Connell is concerned. I still have a lot to answer for in that regard. I kept saying he, and of course it's she, and I have talked about that in a response to the class. However, here we go. Wallace, I do know. And yes, this is a paper that I wrote. I actually wrote this when I was doing my doctorate, and I was beginning to think through some of the conceptual ideas that I wanted to use for my dissertation. And I had come to the same place that Connell actually comes to at the end of his article when she talks about the ways in which the gender policy is resisted. It's resisted both in terms of the external structures, but it's also resisted within a kind of deep consciousness of gender and how it's enacted in everyday life. And so I became really interested in this notion of consciousness and came across Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German philosopher, and some of his work really spoke to me in terms of how we could come to know what sometimes is more broadly known as the other. That is, that which is outside the dominant norm. And in terms of gender relations, the dominant norm happens to be men. And so I wanted to understand, because I was looking at equity policy, I wanted to understand both the personal level of consciousness as well as a more collective notion of consciousness as expressed through policy. Because policy, in a sense, is the coming to some kind of an agreement through political process. It's imperfect, of course, I recognize that, but it is through political process coming to some kind of understanding of a kind of collective consciousness around a particular issue. And it's ideologically driven and it changes over time, etc., just as our consciousness does as an individual. So in Gadamer's work, he talks about three levels of consciousness. And I'm not going to get into a huge amount of specifics. And by the way, the chart in the online copy of the paper is all over higgledy-piggledy. So I put a copy of the actual chart with some other information in it that I use for a later paper on the on our e-class, so you can have a look at that if you feel that you need it to understand the paper. You may not feel that you need it. Charts have limited reliability sometimes, but nevertheless it might be helpful for some of you. But nevertheless, what I came to was these three levels of consciousness using Gadamer's work. The first was conservation, the second was conciliation, and the third was conversation. From my perspective, consciousness is mediated by the broader ideological political environment in which gendered actors work and may work towards change in organizations, including educational organizations. And I came to that conclusion because in talking to the women who were equity officers for three relatively large, one very large board in Ontario. One was a rural board, one was an urban board, and one was a suburban board. This is what they struggled with, was the ways in which the policy as it was stated and as it represented a particular kind of collective consciousness driven by an ideological position of the government at the time was was resisted by individual actors, often in pretty gross ways. And some of the stories they told me kind of curled my hair a little bit, because I was stunned by the ways in which underneath all of that, people could be really nasty and mean to somebody that they saw as representative of these policies that were meant to change the gender regime that Connell describes in her paper. So in these levels of consciousness, then we have, as I said, conservation, conciliation, and conversation. Now, conservation, the first one, is a very conservative, small c conservative approach, wherein the dominant I, the dominant norm, the that person who represents the dominant norm, is unwilling to accept an other who is not like himself. And I'm going to say himself because in this case we're talking about a dominant norm that is male. So that dominant I looks at the other who wishes to become a part of the domain that the dominant I exerts influence in, and keeps that person out, or is very coercive to that person to become like them in order for them to be accepted within that domain. So for example, some women who initially wanted to become principals were simply kept out. One example would be one of the participants in a study I did, where she applied 13 years in a row to be referred to be in the principal's program so that she could become a principal. 13 years in a row, she was turned down until the 13th year, which turned out to be a lucky one for her. And she had to withstand significant resistance from all those almost entirely males who were in the course that she needed to have in order to become a principal. So this conservation space is one that is highly protected by those who are the dominant I and do not want to admit anything other than someone who is like them. So if she was willing to joke around like them, and if she was willing to act like them, and she was willing to tolerate some of the behaviors that they exhibited, then she was able to be kind of reluctantly included in the group. So they would coerce her, or attempt to coerce her into accepting that position. Or she could stand apart, and she did once she was accepted, but she was very reluctantly accepted into that domain. Conciliation, so that would have been prior to the 1970s, when a lot of the discussions started. Early 1970s, I guess it would have been, before a lot of the discussions started that I've already talked about in the first video. And after gender began to be discussed much more seriously around in being more inclusive of women in positions of authority, conciliation became the pattern of interaction between the dominant I and other. So what we have is, first of all, no policy, because there was no consensus around accepting women into the domain that was primarily male. So there was no consensus, no conversation whatsoever, nothing going on in terms of policy. But at the conciliation level, there was policy, and that policy was beginning to say, or was saying, that women needed to be accepted in these roles. And so in order for women to be accepted in these roles, they were helped to become more like the dominant I. So Alison Worrell, for example, wrote a very interesting paper several years ago now, I think in the early 80s, where she talked about, I think it was called something like not suit able for the principalship, something like that. And her point was that she was required to dress in the female version of males. She was required to act in kind of the female version of the males that she was in the group that she was a part of. So this conciliation, so we had the Women's Teachers Federation in Ontario giving lessons to women who wanted to become principals, to dress for success, to find ways to integrate their home life with their professional life. So nothing had changed outside in terms of gender, the way the genders interacted with one another. Women had to find a way to be like and to accommodate with, so that they could be taken seriously in a position of authority. Conversation is a whole different way of approaching consciousness. So at this level of consciousness, there is a meaningful interaction between two actors who are agents within the conversation. They both have the right and the opportunity, and both exhibit the willingness to speak truthfully, to listen carefully, and I think this is the most important piece, to be changed by the conversation. Now, this is the trick. Lots of times people are willing to listen, and they may even be willing to allow the other person to speak, but it's allowing. It's not creating a space for and then being willing to accept what is being said, reject those things that can't be accepted. But, so there's an exchange of ideas and a kind of transformation between the two actors takes place. And so these three levels of consciousness I saw as important. So when we think about it in an educational setting, conservation is maintaining the status quo through exclusion from or coercion to conform to the dominant norm by the other. So in this case, then women disrupt the norm and are excluded or coerced to conform. Conciliation still maintains the status quo, but it enables the entry of the other to its benefits through conforming to its norms. So, as I said, women learn to dress for success, speak to be heard, manage demands, etc. But nothing changes in terms of the systems that are in place around gender norms. Conversation, on the other hand, opens up the possibility of transformation by engaging in a meaningful way with the other and opening norms to challenge and change. So grad classes, board meetings, staff meetings, hall talk, etc. are places where these conversations can take place. So Beth Young talks about this in the context of the academic study of educational administration and the practice of educational administration. One of the spaces for transformative conversations, like I've just described, is in grad classes. So Young looks at the history of academic study of ed admin in Canada and reviews the history of issues around women in leadership and asks a very important question. Where are the women's voices? And they were non-existent. They weren't speaking at conferences, their papers weren't being published, they weren't a part of the broad academic conversation. So she traces the theoretical history of ed admin from positivism, if it can't be seen and empirically verified, then it doesn't exist. And of course, we know all kinds of things in education can't be empirically verified. To theories that provided room for other ways of knowing about issues in ed admin. But she still didn't see evidence that issues of gender were being taken up in a meaningful way. Again, awards weren't being given to work around gender and so on. But she does see a glimmer of hope that actually became eventually a more robust body of knowledge in Canadian ed admin scholarship. And much of what we're going to be looking at in the next while in the course is going to reflect that. There are awards now being given to explicitly feminist work. I think of the last awards for CASIA, which is the Canadian Association for Studies in Educational Administration. The last 3 or 4 awards have been to women doing all kinds of various things, some not feminist at all and some feminist. So things have started to open up, and that demonstrates to a small degree of transformation, but of course there's still lots of conversation to take place. So I hope that this has been helpful to you in thinking through the readings and thinking through the theories that are undergird the readings. And if you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to get in touch with me. I look forward to your input.